The house was quiet except for the hum of the baseboard heater and the faint scratch of my brush outside. Wheat Ridge lay under a brittle crust of snow, the kind that caught the glow of passing headlights and scattered it like glass. I stood at the easel in my small studio corner, layering the final strokes of crimson over the canvas I had been shaping for months. This piece was meant to anchor my portfolio review at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design in Lakewood. Tomorrow morning would decide whether years of late nights and careful savings had been enough to earn me a place there. I was blending a shadow when the door banged open. Kiernan stood there with one of his friends, both carrying the sour scent of cheap beer and bravado. His eyes flicked to the canvas, then to me. With the same look he gave when mocking my night classes, "Women can't code," he said flatly, as if my brushes and paints were proof of failure. "Stop embarrassing us," his friend snorted, muttering something about art being for real men. Before I could form words, Kiernan stepped forward and dragged the box cutter he carried for odd jobs straight through the center of the canvas. The sound was worse than any insult cloth tearing. Paint still wet enough to bleed, my hand froze in midair, brush trembling. Humiliation clamped down on me first, sharp and suffocating, then grief rose. A wave so heavy I thought my knees would give out. But beneath it all, colder than the air that seeped through the old window frame, came fury. I pressed the brush handle into my palm until it hurt and forced myself to look directly at him, memorizing the jagged wound across the canvas as if it might guide me to what I would do next. I leaned against the wall, the ruined canvas still burning in my mind, and for a moment, all I could see were the corridors of my past. The nights when the lights never went off in the medical billing office off West Colfax. The glow of monitors stretching across rows of tired faces. I was one of them, headset pinching my ears, tapping out codes while the city outside slept. Those hours paid for rent, groceries, and Kiernan's endless hobbies, while my sketchbooks waited in the closet. I used to dream of enrolling in studio classes full-time, but instead I poured money into soccer uniforms that never fit past one season. I stitched holes in jerseys under the weak light of the kitchen lamp. When music caught his fancy, I pawned my own easel to buy him a second-hand guitar. When he said coding was the future, I saved to enroll him in a boot camp, standing in the rain after work to pick him up when buses ran late. Each time he quit, I told myself he would find his way if I just kept giving him one more chance. Sacrifice became muscle memory. I often skipped meals, sliding the last portion onto his plate, convincing myself I wasn't hungry. My shoes wore thin before I bought new ones, but I made sure he never walked into school with scuffed soles. What he never knew was that I wrote everything down. Receipts tucked into manila folders, photos of every painting I managed to finish, even notes about hours worked and hours lost. Documenting wasn't about revenge, then it was survival. Proof that I existed beyond the roles of mother, provider, shadow. Now, staring at the jagged rip in my canvas, I realized those quiet records were more than fragments of a hidden life. They were the foundation I would have to stand on, the ledger of what could no longer be erased. The heater clicked off and silence spread through the house. I left the torn canvas leaning against the wall, its gash a wound I wasn't ready to touch. Instead, I opened the flat files beneath my desk. Inside lay the studies I'd built quietly over months' charcoal sketches of mountain ridgelines, watercolor washes that mapped the tones of dawn, compositional grids taped together in careful layers. Each one was a breadcrumb leading to the final piece. Beside them were the prints I'd made at the library down on 38th Avenue, high-resolution photographs of the work in progress. My laptop hummed awake, and there were the digital files, layered PSDs, scans, Even the generative sketches I'd coded late at night, when Kiernan thought I was only paying bills. Line by line, pattern by pattern. They mapped a language of process no knife could erase. I unlocked my phone to check the time, but another notification pulled me in. A message thread left open on Kiernan's screen earlier that evening had synced to the cloud. His words to his friend glared back. She thinks she's going to RMCAD. Watch this. She'll have nothing to show tomorrow. My throat tightened, but my hands steadied. I took screenshots, forwarded them to my own drive, then printed copies on the old inkjet humming in the corner. Proof sat warm in my hands. Piece by piece, I gathered a new submission, the surviving sketches, the printed photographs, the process binder I'd updated just last week. Even the fragments of the slashed canvas, I pressed them flat between sheets of newsprint. If I had to, I would show the jury the damage and the strength it revealed by the time the first gray light filtered over the snow outside. A portfolio sat boxed on my desk, not as I had planned, but alive all the same. And in that quiet moment, I understood that what Kiernan had meant as erasure might yet become the sharpest edge of my story. The snow along Wadsworth Boulevard had thinned into gritty banks by the time I pulled into the parking lot at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. The campus buildings, brick and industrial, caught the bright Colorado sun in a way that made them look both worn and enduring. My hands clutched the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale. The box on the passenger seat held everything I had managed to salvage through the night, and the thought of carrying it across the lot made my chest tighten. For a moment, I considered turning the key in the ignition and driving away. A night of stitching fragments together felt fragile against the weight of professional jurors and an exam that could determine whether I stayed buried in billing codes or finally breathed as an artist. A tap at the window startled me. Miriam Page, my neighbor, leaned down with her knowing smile. She had insisted on coming along, claiming errands in Lakewood as an excuse. I stepped out, knees unsteady, and she took the box from me without a word. "You've carried heavier things than this," she murmured. Her hand pressed briefly against my shoulder, steadying me, and together we crossed the lot. Inside, the review room smelled faintly of turpentine and printer ink. 3 jurors sat behind a long table, portfolios already stacked beside them. At the center was Professor Nikhil Rao, known for his sharp critiques and unexpected kindness. He motioned for me to begin. I opened the box, showing the sketches first. My voice wavered as I explained the studies, then steadied as I laid out the photographs, the layered files, the printed grids. When I reached the fragments of the slashed canvas, I didn't pretend it hadn't happened. I told them plainly my work had been destroyed the night before, but the process remained intact. Professor Rao leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, and the patterns he asked. I pulled out my laptop and opened the generative sketches, code spinning colors across the screen. The room grew still, the hum of the projector filling the silence. Their eyes stayed on the shifting forms, not on the torn canvas, and for the first time in days, I felt the air move back into my lungs as if possibility itself had been restored. The code sketches bloomed across the screen in shifting lattices of line and color, each iteration building on the last, like a painter layering translucent glazes. I explained how the algorithm generated forms that echoed natural growth branches, veins, rivers, and how I had used those patterns as the hidden understructure of my painting. The final canvas might have been slashed, but the bones of it were alive in these digital iterations. Professor Rao tilted his head, eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with interest. One of the other jurors, a woman with silver hair and paint-stained fingertips, leaned closer to watch the patterns morph. I felt their focus tighten. Not on the wreckage I carried, but on the bridge I had quietly built between code and brush. "This is unusual," Rao said finally. Voice even. "Not many applicants bring computational methods into painting." "It's not a replacement," I said quickly. Afraid they might think I leaned on machines. "It's scaffolding. A way to test possibilities before I commit them to canvas. The painting grows from both the human gesture and the coded pattern." The silver-haired juror nodded slowly, as though mapping the logic in her own mind. "And when the painting was destroyed, the scaffolding remained." Her words settled in my chest like a weight shifting from one shoulder to another. Yes, that was exactly what I had been trying to hold on to since last night. I showed them the fragments next, laid carefully on black foam board, the gash still visible, but edges aligned to reveal how the lattice had guided the composition instead of hiding the wound. I let it speak alongside the sketches. They murmured to one another in quiet tones, glances flicking from the torn surface to the glowing screen. At last, Rao turned back to me. "We will need a week to deliberate," he said. "But we have a request. Next Friday is the art walk on Santa Fe Drive. Bring these fragments. Bring your sketches. Let the public see them." I blinked, stunned. What had begun as an exam was now becoming a stage. The pieces I thought had ended my chances might instead be the opening act of something larger. And the thought carried me out of the room with a steadier step than I had dared imagine. By the time I returned home, the afternoon sun had already dipped low, streaking Sloane's Lake with a pale orange sheen. The box of fragments rested in my trunk, but I carried something heavier inside the certainty that the damage had a face, and it was waiting in my kitchen. Kiernan sat at the table, scrolling his phone as though nothing had happened. I set my laptop down, opened the folder, and placed the printed screenshots between us. Text messages glared in ink, his words bragging to his friend about tearing through my canvas. Laughing at how I'd have nothing to show, his shoulders stiffened. "You went through my stuff." "No," I said, voice low. "You left your trail on the cloud. You wanted an audience. Now you have one." I slid across the time-stamped images of him entering my studio, the photos I'd taken of the slashed painting. "Explain." For a moment, he tried to hold the smirk, but it crumbled. His jaw worked, then loosened. "Because you make me look small," he muttered. "You think you're better than me. Always talking about art, about coding. I never learned it." "All right," I lied. "To my friends. About projects. About gallery contacts. I couldn't stand you actually pulling it off." The words should have stung, but what I felt was colder pity mixing with anger. His cruelty hadn't come from strength. It was envy hollowing him out. I steadied myself. "You owe me restitution. For the materials. For the time. You'll sign a plan. Or you'll leave this house." His head snapped up, panic flickering behind his eyes. "Where would I go?" "You'll figure it out. Your friend already has. He left when he saw what you did." Silence thickened between us. The heater clicking on in the corner. He looked smaller than he had the night before. Deflated. Stripped of the swagger he wore like armor, I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. The lines had been drawn, no longer in charcoal or paint, but in boundaries he could not cross again. And as I walked toward my studio, I knew exactly how I would turn his sabotage into something he could never undo. The next evening, I pulled the ruined canvas from its hiding place and laid it flat across the dining table. The gash cut straight through the composition, raw edges curling where the fibers had torn. I trimmed the loose threads carefully, then threaded a heavy needle with linen cord. Each stitch was slow, deliberate, binding the wound into a visible seam. When the pieces finally held together, I traced the fractures with delicate lines of gold leaf, letting them gleam under the lamplight like rivers carved into stone. I began to see what the painting wanted to become. No longer the polished piece I had planned, but something more defiant. I named it in my mind, Undeleted. On rice paper, I printed Kiernan's words, the very insults he had thrown at me. Women can't code. Stop embarrassing us. I tore the sheets into strips, layering them beneath translucent washes of paint. The text ghosted through, half hidden, like a whisper trying and failing to bury itself. Instead of erasing the damage, I let it live inside the work, a reminder of the lie that had tried to silence me. When the last glaze dried, I wheeled the piece down to Miriam's garage. She had already set out her tools, a fresh oak frame waiting. Together, we lifted the canvas, measured, and cut. She held the frame steady while I drove the nails, each strike echoing louder than the last. Standing back, I finally saw it as a whole. The stitches, the gold seams, the layered text, and the projected generative pattern spilling across its surface. It was no longer a broken painting, but a declaration. Pain was no longer the background. It was the centerpiece. Miriam exhaled and gave a short nod. This is stronger than what you started with. Her words followed me into the night as I wrapped the piece for transport, already picturing the crowded streets of Santa Fe Drive and the gallery walls where Undeleted would finally be seen. Santa Fe Drive was alive with music and the smoky pull of food trucks when I arrived. The galleries spilled light onto the sidewalks, laughter and conversation weaving through the cold night air. I carried Undeleted inside, heart hammering as Miriam and I lifted it onto the wall. The projector clicked on, casting the generative patterns across the stitched seams so the gold leaf caught and scattered the light. Within minutes, people clustered around. Strangers leaned in, tracing the stitched gashes, whispering about the text barely visible beneath the paint. The projection shifted, and the crowd murmured, drawn closer each time the patterns pulsed across the surface. I stood near the back, almost afraid to claim it as mine, until I heard someone say, "Whoever did this understands how to turn harm into design." A woman with cropped hair and a sharp gaze introduced herself as Leda Beaumont, a gallerist I recognized by reputation. She asked if I had a studio she could visit. The words caught in my throat, but I managed a yes, giving her my number with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. Then, as if the night hadn't already carried enough weight, I saw Kiernan near the doorway. He looked smaller under the gallery lights, stripped of the bravado he wore so easily at home. When his friends asked about the piece, he muttered, "It was me. I ruined it. She made it better." I watched the shame wash over him as they turned away. Unimpressed by his confession, I didn't move toward him. I let the silence do what I never could show him the cost of his choices. Later, at home, the gallery glow still in my mind, my phone buzzed. An email from the RMCAD jury filled the screen. Their deliberation was complete, and I opened it with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The email from the jury was short but decisive. I had been awarded the Merit Scholarship and a materials stipend. They cited not only the strength of my work, but also the resilience shown in my process. Reading those words, I felt something unclench deep inside me. It wasn't simply approval. It was validation that the path I had walked in silence all these years was finally visible. The next morning, I laid the restitution agreement on the kitchen table. Kiernan signed without argument, his eyes fixed on the paper as though each stroke of the pen drained him further. He moved into a friend's rental near Alameda that same week, carrying only what he could afford to keep. I changed the locks the next day, the sound of the bolt sliding home louder in my ears than any applause from strangers. I set clear rules in writing. No more bailouts. No more second chances unless he proved he could honor the first. I offered one condition: I would pay for one community college course of his choice, but only if he completed it. No completion, no support. The terms were simple, and for once, the balance of power was mine to hold. Standing in the quiet of the house, I realized the justice I wanted was not about watching him fall. It was about ensuring I no longer carried the weight of his choices. The line between us had been redrawn, not with paint or thread, but with boundaries. That evening, I returned to my studio and unwrapped Undeleted. Propping it against the wall, it no longer looked like a wound. It looked like the beginning of something I had waited far too long to claim, and the thought carried me into the days ahead. The first time I turned the key in the studio door at RMCAD, I paused to feel the weight of it. The small brass teeth slid easily into the lock, but to me, it was heavier than any burden I had carried before. Inside, sunlight spilled across concrete floors, the smell of turpentine and wood stretching wide in the air. My space, my name on the roster, my future shaped in square footage I didn't have to borrow. Undeleted leaned against the far wall, waiting to be crated for the juried show that had accepted it. I traced the gold seams with my eyes, still amazed at how the torn canvas had become the very proof of my survival. It would hang under gallery lights soon, no longer the remnant of sabotage, but the artifact of resilience. On Saturdays, I began leading a small workshop for undergraduates curious about bridging code and paint. We called it Code on canvas. Watching younger artists write a few lines of JavaScript and see patterns bloom across the projector screen reminded me of the nights I had stitched together my own courage. Their eyes lit up the way mine once had, when I still believed there was space for me in this world. At the end of a long day, I pulled a fresh canvas onto the easel, powered up my laptop, and opened the sketches I had been refining. A lattice of projected lines spread across the white surface, delicate and waiting, like veins on paper. I picked up a brush, felt the bristles flex, and finally exhaled. The lock had turned, the door was open, and this time, the space inside belonged wholly to me.